Hello and welcome to another episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn from holiday time, vacation time, North Germany. We're finally on break, and I'm having the great pleasure today to talk to somebody who is more in my shoes on the outside of academia, liking to write about academic stuff and history. And he, my guest here, has recently published a really interesting book with Fordham University Press, which is called Our Onward March, The Grand Army of the Republic in the Progressive Era. And this author is Jonathan Noy. He, as I already said, is not in academia. He has a PhD, however, from Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, where he is still living. His wife is an archivist, and he is a editor. He has worked as a managing editor, editorial assistant, journal production manager at a couple of firms, I guess would be the right word choice in the Pittsburgh area. So it's a great pleasure to that you took the time to talk to us today, Jonathan, and that you are going to tell us a little about your new book.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Niels. It's great to join you and have this opportunity.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. I really enjoyed your book, as I already said in our sort of little pre-interview chat. So you you obviously are not in academia anymore, as I already said. But you did get your PhD. You have a master's in history as well. So how did you get interested in, is it the focus on the progressive era or the GAR? I mean, whichever one you kind of want to take it with.
Yeah, I mean, it was more the GAR, but to, I guess, broaden the story a little bit, it is kind of difficult for me to find the exact starting point for this book. I was thinking about, and I guess it would be dangerous and somewhat long-winded for me to say that it started with my first visit to the Gettysburg battlefield as a child, but I think that's fair.
I've heard that a few times.
Yeah, as a young person and then as a young adult, I was really taken, as I suppose is the case for a lot of young men, with military history and Civil War
Mhm.
military exploits initially. And that's probably what took me to Gettysburg College for my undergraduate
Mm.
work. And it was really there at Gettysburg that I was exposed for the first time to scholarship on Civil War memory, and in particular, David Blight's Race and Reunion,
Mhm.
which, as I recall, was published around 2001, and I had just entered Gettysburg College in 2004, so it was,
Mm.
big at the time. And we could talk more about David Blight's influence on Civil War memory scholarship later, but I think that paired with this enviable opportunity that I had at Gettysburg College to go out every weekend basically to explore the battlefield, explore those hundreds of monuments that dot the landscape there, and
Mm.
then I started learning more about the history of the placement of those monuments and who was involved and the
Mm.
veterans reunions that were occurring there on the battlefield. And so I was able to start asking questions about things like battlefield preservation and monumentation and memory and Civil War memory. And so those questions and interests followed me as I, continued on with my master's and then with my doctoral work at Carnegie Mellon University here in Pittsburgh. And then starting with a graduate research seminar at Carnegie Mellon, I had to start thinking more seriously about what was my contribution to the scholarship going to be,
Mm.
and I started flailing around for some for some topics, and I had learned somehow about a it was an Andrew Carnegie funded library in the small town of Carnegie, Pennsylvania. And it was not always called Carnegie. I think it was called Mansfield, Pennsylvania at one time, but in the 1890s it was renamed Carnegie. And this was not far from where I lived at that time. but I learned that they had the records of the local Grand Army of the Republic post that
Mm,
met in Carnegie in that library I just mentioned.
mm,
And not only that, but they had also preserved the room, the headquarters of this
mm,
local GAR post. And just as an interesting sort of side story about that, this room that was used as the GAR post headquarters was actually closed off, basically barricaded in the 1930s when the last GAR member of that post passed away.
mm,
And it remained barricaded like that for 50 years until the early 1990s when it was finally reopened. And, there you have this time capsule of what a
mm,
GAR post room, looked like in the 1930s. This was called the SP post, by the way, ESPY, and it was named after a deceased, I believe, captain that was killed during the Civil War, and they named the post after him. But now this place is open for tours. It's still a
mm,
working library, but you can take tours of this room.
mm,
And so, I was fortunate to have almost free reign over this research material at this
mm,
library. And initially, I was working on themes related to the Grand Army of the Republic and its establishment of pensions, pension rights
mm,
for Union veterans. And I was trying to connect that with sort of a gender interpretation too, like how
mm,
did Union veterans maintain their masculinity and their manliness while still accepting pensions from the government. Um, Ultimately decided that's not what I wanted to keep with long term. And so I sort of switched gears and noticed that much of the GAR scholarship up to that point was really only addressing the GAR
mm,
up to the year maybe 1890 or maybe
mm,
at best 1900. And then scholars sort of implying that after that maybe 1900 period, these old men are just dying off or they're very navel gazy and they're just sort of
mm,
swapping old war stories
yeah,
in a very nostalgic way. And
mm,
that outsiders are just kind of seeing these guys as old relics of bygone days.
mm,
But what I was noticing with the SB Post records, and then when I started expanding my research to other local GAR Post records, was that these guys were surprisingly active in their communities in
mm,
various ways after the year 1900, well into the US progressive era, and that they're not just insulating themselves in their post rooms,
mm,
trying to fend off all this change that's occurring in the modernizing United States, and that they have really varied ways that they're conducting local
mm,
level activism.
mm,
And so that's what interested me in exploring the activism of the GAR in the progressive era
mm,
and writing about these activities, about this culture, especially between the years about 1890 to 1920. And so that's how the dissertation formed. And not long after I received my PhD in 2018, I was fortunate to be contacted by Dr. Andrew Slapp, who is
mm,
with East Tennessee State University. But he's also the series editor of a series of books called Reconstructing America
mm,
with Fordham University Press. And he asked me if I was interested in, paring down that long dissertation into a book-length manuscript. And I turned him down initially. I had just, started my career in publishing, and I didn't think
mm,
I'd have the time for it. So it was probably 3 years that passed until I finally thought, I owe it to these veterans, I think, to tell their
mm,
story. And I wanted to get the book out there
yeah,
again. So I approached Dr. Slapp again, and the offer was still there. And
mm.
the rest is history. The book's out as of earlier this year. So,
Yeah, no, I remember Andrew offered to and approached me about my first book too, and I
oh,
already was under contract at that time, so he
I see. Oh,
unfortunately
interesting.
was not able to get it.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe
Made the
eventually.
process very easy for me though. So that was great.
Yeah, he's a very proactive kind of series editor searching for fitting projects, which is great, and he
Yeah.
seems to work with young authors too that are still building their experience. So it's Heard only good things.
Absolutely. I was very fortunate.
Yeah. But see, that's the part that was really interesting about your book because you really bit off a lot with it because you have the Civil War memory historiography on on one side, sort of like trying to get a handle on a incredibly growing literature, especially by the time you were working on the dissertation and then revising the book, because in the last 10 years that has just exploded.
Yeah.
And then, of course, a progressive era historiography too, with these, like, I always remember it from grad school, these debates of like, who were the progressives? Who are these individuals that constituted this political movement? So, which one did you find the kind of easier or more interesting of these two groups, historiographies, to kind of engage with?
Yeah, boy. Neither was easy, I guess.
Mm,
So I guess I think I tend to place myself more in the Civil War memory camp, and I would sort of oblige to bring in the progressive, historiography a little bit into at least
mm,
into the introduction of the book for some historiographical grounding. But
mhm,
um, you know, I do think to get back to David Blight for a minute and Race and Reunion, I think it is a good starting point for
mhm,
talking about Civil War memory scholarship. And I won't go too detailed about his thesis because I imagine your listeners probably know some things about the Blight thesis, but basically has these three models of Civil War memory, the
mhm,
emancipationist memory that
mhm,
centered slavery as the crux of the cause of the war, emancipation, abolition of slavery as being a really important outcome of that war. You have the white supremacist memory of the war that
mhm,
does just the opposite. It's downplaying slavery. It's sort
mhm,
of the basis of lost cause
mhm,
mythology. And then you have this reconciliationist memory that borrows a lot
mhm,
from the white supremacist memory, and in a way allows North, I should say, white North and white South
mhm,
to shake hands right after the
yeah,
war, uh, allows the country to continue to
mhm,
progress after this wrenching war. And obviously, Blight's work is highly influential and
mhm,
remains extremely important, what, a quarter century after it was published. But it did open itself up to not necessarily attack, but it opened itself up to some new opportunities for nuance and some
mhm,
clarifications. And I think a lot of historians, as you said, have been kind of grappling with that in the
mhm,
25, almost 25 years since its
mhm,
publication, and shown that this reconciliationist model that David Blight was
mhm,
advancing doesn't necessarily always fit very neatly whenever
mhm,
you look at things on the ground. So, more talented historians than me have tackled this. I think of William Blair, John Neff have
mhm,
discussed commemoration of the dead, and how that commemoration of the dead did not allow for this easy reconciliation between North and South.
mhm,
Carolyn Janney, I have her book here right next to me, Remembering the Civil War, Reunion, and the
mhm,
Limits of Reconciliation. Uh, I think that book has done a great job to show that this rhetoric of reconciliation could belie realities on the ground about resistance to reconciliation, um, not just among African Americans, but also among some white Northern veterans, which, I think I tie myself into that a little bit in this research. And then I have to give, a shout out to Barbara Gannon too, in her book, The One Cause, WON, which the subtitle Black and White Comradeship in the Grand Army of the Republic. And she's showing how the GAR was this integrationist, interracial organization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which is often forgotten, I think, in the scholarship, and in that way is serving as an obstacle to reconciliation
mhm,
during that period. So I guess, like I said, I'm tying myself in, I think, with these scholars who are giving some nuance to David Blight's
mhm,
thesis, and to show that Union veterans are using their activities, their activism well into the 20th century to
mhm,
prove that their cause was the just one, and standing up to this lost cause
mhm,
mythology that's growing during that period. Um, so yeah, so like I said, I think that has always been my I guess more of my interest was Civil
mhm,
War memory, and how I was trying to position myself in the scholarship. But you're right that I did have to discuss progressive era literature scholarship
mhm,
if I'm trying to say that these guys are activists during the progressive era, and that was a challenge. To understand the GAR as part of the progressive activists of the turn of the 20th century. We sort of have to move away from the view of some GAR scholars like Stuart McConnell, for example. He wrote kind of the first social history of the
mhm,
GAR in the early 90s. And he interprets the GAR as this very rigid, law
mhm,
and order organization, a nostalgia infused group that sort of feared change, used their post rooms as sort of a bastion from this disconcerting change of immigration and
mhm,
industrialization. And I think instead, we sort of need to start from the assumption that the terms progressivism, even the progressive era, are very
mhm,
should be very fluid
mhm,
ones, fluid definitions. Because if you think about it, progressivism, I think, is a big tent. It includes a lot of varied people. You can think Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. You can think
mhm,
Jane Addams. You can think Jacob Riis. They all fall under this big
mhm,
tent or this umbrella of
yeah,
progressivism. And so I submit that the members of the GAR fit under this big tent.
mhm,
Like your quote unquote typical progressive activists, they tended to be part of the middle class. Obviously,
mhm,
not all Union veterans were of the middle class, but if you're in the GAR, you had to have some money to pay for a
mhm,
uniform, for example.
yeah,
So you tended to be of the middle class. Obviously, they had a faith in collectivist activism. They're
mhm,
in a collective organization, right? They believed in an engaged citizenship,
mhm,
and they believed in advancing various prescriptions
right,
to, mollify the country
mhm,
or improve the country in some way. And what's different about them is that they are obviously older members of society. They're in their 60s and 70s when I'm talking about them in the book, and they come with, I guess, sage wisdom and lessons that they learned from their Civil War
mhm,
service about democracy, freedom, and order. And they believe that those lessons from the past could shape, the modern, I guess, the present and the future of the country as we
mhm.
get into the 20th century. So, um, I guess that's my pitch of how I'm positioning myself with the progressive era literature too.
Yeah, no, and I kind of felt like I never got the chance to interview him, but Matt Stanley's Grand Army of Labor,
Mm-hmm.
as sort of like you two have a lot sort of that you bring to each other, sort of where you correlate of sort of like him more from like the class perspective, where you're kind of more from the progressive historiography, kind of looking at sort of these activist former veteran well, activist former soldiers and veterans who are trying to in some form improve their communities.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's unfortunate. I only encountered Stanley's work, pretty late in the
Yeah.
manuscript process. So I speak with him, or I speak historiographically with him a little
Yeah.
bit in that book. But I wish I had encountered that book a little earlier. What is that?
He is a he is very easy in that he is always talking about class and Marxism. So he's he's a I have had encountered him at a couple of conferences, and he was working near me in Georgia. So
Oh,
he
okay.
was, and of course, his book came out just as he was moving to Arkansas, and
Oh, is that right? Okay.
so it my email disappeared for him, and then yeah, I moved on to other things when I
Yeah,
finally encountered him, and he was like, "Sorry, I missed that email." And
things come up. We understand.
yeah, yeah. So you're the stand-in. You're doing double duty.
Right.
So you have a nice blue background where he would have a red one.
Exactly. Right. I made a point to wear the blue shirt, have the blue background.
Yes, yes. Um, so the you start. I really enjoyed the start of the book because you took us to the middle of Kansas,
Right.
and it's like it was something where I was like, you kind of were like, where is he going with this? In as you start the book, and it was really beautiful in that because you immediately draw the audience in to kind of trying to understand this late early 20th century environment where the veterans are activists in this community, and there's the old, like we usually don't think of old men, old white men as activists. Usually we think
Right.
of them usually as conservatives.
Right. Right. I'm glad you enjoyed the intro. The anecdotes is what I love to write the most.
Mm,
Those hooks like that. But yeah, very much. So we really need to reinterpret, I think, the state, what I want to say, sort of the lifespan of the GAR. We have to
mm,
sort of reinterpret what we think are the stages in the lifespan of the Grand Army of the Republic. And it might be beneficial to sort of discuss briefly what I think
mm,
or what the the established, I guess,
mm,
idea of the lifespan of the VAR is, and how I'm trying to change that narrative a little bit. So, with the GAR, it has this very long and interesting lifespan.
mm,
It basically lasts almost exactly 90 years. It was founded in 1866 in Illinois.
mm,
And it lasts 90 years until 1956 with the death
mm,
of the famous Albert Woolson in Minnesota. Uh,
mm,
and I think most historians will say that that first period of the GAR lifespan occurs between 1866 and the early 1870s when the organization begins attracting Union veteran members, especially in the Midwest, and then on the East,
mm,
sort of on the East Coast there. Uh, and it's around ideals like camaraderie,
mm,
comradeship, mutual aid,
mm,
charity. It's during this period that you have famous names like General John A. Logan. He becomes the
mm,
commander in chief for a year of that early GAR. He establishes Memorial Day as a holiday. Then we have this period, sort of the early 1870s through the early 1880s, when GAR membership really drops off
mm,
precipitously. And there are a couple theories for this. One of them is that the GAR, it was always a Republican leaning group. This is the party of Lincoln. That's probably not totally surprising. But in the 1870s, the GAR was very overtly Republican. It was, getting involved in elections, trying to elect people like Logan and his peers to office.
mm,
And, it seemed like some members were kind of against this overt
mm,
partisanship in the GAR.
mm,
But also, the GAR of the 1870s took the unpopular step of adopting some rituals from Freemasonry and some of these
mm,
other secret societies of that day. For instance, there was like a grade system that was instituted in the GAR where you start as a recruit and then you graduate to a soldier and then you graduate to a veteran. And that was offensive to a lot of these early
Veterans.
GAR players because they're veterans already. They don't
Yeah.
want to be they don't want to be called a recruit. So that causes this decline in the 1870s, early 1880s of GAR membership. But then we have this resurgence in the 1880s and then into the early 1890s when we have the GAR being reinvigorated.
Mm,
We have membership peaking at around 400,000 men around 1890. in part because the GAR is becoming this pension advocacy.
Hmm.
Uh, this is the time when legislation is being passed mostly by Republicans, just supporters like Benjamin Harrison, for example, that are signing legislation into law for pension rights. Um, but you also have the establishment at this time of the very influential National Tribune newspaper. So it was it probably circulated among tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of veterans during the 1880s and 1890s. So and we're seeing GAR veterans in a more visible sense in their communities. They're taking part in Memorial Day parades. You're going to see them on parade, during Independence Day
Hmm.
celebration. You're going to see them at state encampments and national encampments. Those are those big reunions where the veterans will come together in larger towns if it's a state encampment, or big cities if it's a national encampment.
Hmm.
Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, coming once a year to these locations to commune and share comradeship and also set the agenda for the GAR for the coming year as well. And then lastly, I would argue that many historians are viewing the years after 1890, or certainly the years after 1900, as that last stage when GAR membership is declining because of
Hmm.
the old age of the veterans and they're starting to die off. In this idea, as I mentioned before, that these guys are just becoming relics of a, of
Hmm.
a lost age. So where I'm trying to insert myself here is saying that we're kind of forgetting an important stage in the lifespan of the GAR between about 1890 and 1920, when, yes, they're growing older, but they have some really inventive
Hmm.
ways that they're, trying to influence their communities, trying to influence educational reform. They have opinions about foreign policy and the imperialism of the day. And, we could talk more about that. But in terms of the lifespan of the GAR, that's kind of where I'm trying to reinterpret something.
Yeah. And it's interesting considering like I guess we can start sort of with the reform part. I do want to look at the monuments and buildings that they put up eventually too, but
Yeah.
these one of the reforms that you highlighted a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of is reminiscent because you also eventually, and I want to talk about that too, because you do briefly bring in sort of like the American Legion and foreign veterans of foreign wars in the First World War, Great War kind of period. But they're also very activist when it comes to education and but this the Great Army of the Republic veterans wanted educational reforms. They wanted like curriculums, textbooks. It's almost a little reminiscent of what the Lost Cause UDC does, right? Of like we want the right narrative out there.
Right. Very much. So, um, yeah, to kind of address this, I guess the educational reform and the clashes with, especially as you said, especially the UDC. I don't know if they're
Mm,
clashing quite as much with Confederate veterans about this.
mm,
It really seems to be the UDC that's kind of taking this on in the South. But it's fairly well known, I think, in the Civil War memory literature that veterans are showing up in the public
mm,
schools. I don't address that very much in the book because it is kind of
mm,
trodden ground,
mm,
I guess. But they're coming into the schools at holidays, at
mhm,
Memorial Day. They're invited to give talks to children about their war experiences and about proper remembrance of the Union dead. Um, and again, that's probably not too surprising because if you think about it, um, Union veterans, generally speaking, had the good fortune to enjoy a public school education in their
mhm,
youth. So they
right,
seem to be pretty comfortable about entering the public schools and
mhm,
influencing children in that way. But and you had mentioned the textbook debates too. I don't mention that a whole lot because some scholars have done some great work on that. James Martin has talked about
mhm,
the raging textbook debates and whose memory of the war is going
mhm,
to take center stage in these textbooks. Um, but what I really found interesting doing my research and what I sort of formed a chapter on in the book is that the GAR is not stopping at public schools.
Mm-hmm.
They are also going into the colleges and universities and libraries and historical societies. They're going into these other institutions that have been overlooked, I think, in the
Mm-hmm.
scholarship. So they very much recognize these burgeoning college campuses of the late 19th and early 20th centuries as important forums
Mm-hmm.
to spread what I think is a collective GAR memory
Mm-hmm.
of the Civil War. And some of the ways they do this is maybe unsurprising. They donate flags, they install flag poles to run up the flag. They donate. They sometimes will, I guess, contact the War Department officials and ask for a cannon to be placed on a college campus, and that's done from time to time. But there are also some really surprising things that they do too. So, for example, I have evidence of GAR members going to normal schools, which are teachers' schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they go to give speeches to teachers about how they should be teaching American history.
Mm-hmm.
They are sponsoring scholarships, which I think is really fascinating. That
Mm-hmm.
they are using their post funds to sponsor students, usually destitute progeny, sons, grandsons,
Mm-hmm.
granddaughters of veterans, of Union
Mm-hmm.
veterans, to go to college. There's a great example of the Allegheny. I'm in Allegheny County here in Pittsburgh. So there's the Allegheny County Grand Army Association. So it's the most important GAR leaders in the Pittsburgh area. They're actually granting scholarships to African
Mm-hmm.
American young women to go to the University of Pittsburgh,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is fascinating. We have the GAR supporting colleges in the East Tennessee area, in the Southern Appalachia
Mm-hmm.
area, the Lincoln Memorial University and
Mm-hmm.
Grant Memorial University, East Tennessee there, and are they very much saw the people of Appalachia to have been
Mm-hmm.
supportive of the Union during the Civil War. So why not reward them with
Mm-hmm.
educational benefits? So they're donating money to those. There's even examples of GAR members supporting the HBCUs, the historically
Mm-hmm.
Black colleges and universities, to
Mm-hmm.
give African Americans a better chance at education in this late 19th, early 20th century period. So, um, just this is just a taste of some of the
Mm-hmm.
surprising, I guess, educational reforms that that I was seeing in my research. I also have a sort of a case study of this interesting institution called Memorial University,
Gonna ask about
which
that.
is okay. Yeah, so just to talk about it briefly, it is a really interesting chapter in the
Mm-hmm.
history of the GAR. Um, so when I was doing my research, I kept encountering the veterans talking about this strange place called Memorial University. I had never heard of it. They're constantly sending donations of money to Memorial University. So I asked my dissertation, my advisor at Carnegie Mellon about this, and he knew a little bit about it
Mm-hmm.
because he was from Mason City, Iowa, which is the
Oh.
location of this institution that was set up by the GAR and its auxiliaries called Memorial University. So, yeah, so basically, I called this sort of the boldest experiment
Yeah.
in GAR educational reform. The idea was to set up one university. Initially, they thought maybe Washington, D.C. would be a good place for it
Mm-hmm.
because it connect with like George Washington's
Mm-hmm.
preference to have a national university in a nation's capital. But it ends up in northern Iowa, um, mostly because of the enthusiasm of the people in that area and also the enthusiasm of some of the sons of Union veterans that were in that area. So, taking a step back, the GAR had some auxiliaries like the Women's Relief Corps, the WRC, which is the wives and daughters of Union veterans, and also the sons of Union veterans, obviously sons and grandsons of Union veterans. And there's just this wellspring of support in northern Iowa to host this national university. The GAR loves it. the GAR members are trying to influence the curriculum to teach
Mhm.
the proper version of the Civil War and of American history. There are GAR members on the board of this school.
Mhm.
It's kind of a sad story because it does only last about a decade before it founders.
Mhm.
It never really graduates the type of student they intended. It's mostly a preparatory academy in a normal school, a teacher's school, and they offer some business classes. So it never actually, matriculates college graduates. But it had a big vision, and it and
Mhm.
you know, I think it is one of these grand experiments in advancing that grand army memory of the Civil War by teaching the younger generations what they think is the proper history of the
Mhm.
war of the country.
Well, and tied to that is the other aspects that you kind of highlight in the books that sort of the focus with education is sort of industry duty and patriotism that like
Yeah.
this speaks to the patriotism, the kind of the duties that you have to perform in defense of your country.
Mhm.
Um, but the kind of third aspect there, sort of the idea of industry being industrious, also kind of very much deeply enshrined sort of in US history with sort of Jefferson's yeoman farmer idea, I guess, and then sort of even continued with Booker T. Washington on some level with Tuskegee, right? And this is exactly that time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't made that connection to Jefferson. I think you're absolutely right, and Booker T. Washington too. I think it's also why it might be easy for me to kind of lump the GAR into
Mm,
this broad collection of progressive era reformers too,
hmm.
because
Yeah.
you can think of an Andrew Carnegie. I think he would, he's for this
Hmm.
industriousness too, and using, for all his faults, using education as a way to improve society through the libraries he
Hmm.
created. And I think the GAR is of that same vein of advancing industry and industriousness and
Hmm.
practical education. They talk about applied patriotism at Memorial University, which is a little bit of a hazy, what does that mean exactly? But I think it does incorporate this idea of being an
Hmm.
industrious person for your country and improving the country in that
Hmm.
way, maintaining its progress into the 20th century.
Yeah, and also sort of like maybe mistrust towards like these politician generals, right, from the old days that led you in the wrong direction. So do you want to trust the intellectually high elite, right? Sort of like,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I mean, speculative.
Yeah, I think you're onto
Yeah.
something there. Yeah, I'd have to think on that one, but yeah, interesting.
There's your next article.
Yeah, there we go.
Uh, that's yeah. But it's sort of interesting how much veterans are involved during this period in education and sort of seeing that as part of sort of the legacy that they want to leave to the country at large, that they want to have that remembrance of their service put to the younger generation and their communities.
Right, right. And I didn't even, discuss libraries too that
Yeah, that's where
um
I'm going to head.
oh, okay, great. Yeah, I mean the links between post Civil War libraries and GAR posts, it's really
Mm,
fascinating. They oftentimes will share. I mentioned the SP Post, for example. They
mhm,
shared space. Their headquarters
mm,
are in the same building as the library of this
mm,
community. And there are plenty of examples of GAR posts
mm,
helping to fund their community's first libraries.
mm,
And many of them feel that it's very natural
mhm,
that the GAR should be holding their meetings in a library.
mm,
And it's very natural for people to be going to the library, maybe seeing the GAR
mm,
veterans there, and maybe thinking about their comrades who have,
mm,
passed away, or maybe they died during the war itself. They very much intertwine education, libraries, memory
mhm,
together in these spaces. Um, so yeah, I think you could find many libraries still standing today
Hmm.
where the local GAR poets were meeting. And also, it's probably worth mentioning too, that's where a lot of the primary source material on the GAR is located now, is in local libraries. That's where these dying GAR veterans
Hmm.
uh, thought would be the best location for their records to be held for all time is in their local library, and you'll find minute books and diaries and letters and all sorts of things in local libraries around the country.
Which, since you opened that door, I'm going to step through it. Which made your job a lot more difficult because you had to go
Yeah,
through all these little libraries and figure out do they have garpos and do they have material and is
right.
it worth my time to go to these
Yeah,
four little towns in Idaho, Indiana, and kind of see if there's anything worth my time.
right. Difficult, but honestly, a lot of fun too.
Hmm.
I during the course of my graduate work, I would go on these swings essentially to like there'd be a
Little
New
road
England
trips.
swing, yeah, little road trips. There'd be a New England
Yeah.
swing, there'd be a Midwest swing. Got to go out to Oregon and do kind of a swing out there too.
Good
Um,
gosh.
yeah, yeah. So it was a lot of fun
Hmm.
to do that stuff, but yeah, it was very hit or miss too as to what you're going to find.
Hmm.
I guess it is. I guess a little frustrating to the GAR historian that the GAR surprisingly didn't think on a national level,
Hmm.
didn't really think too much about uh, their legacy in the sense of like bringing together all of their records into one location, so that that their progeny could enjoy
Hmm.
looking at their records. It's kind of strange in that way, since they cared about their legacy in so many ways, but not so much in the
Hmm.
preservation of their material. And so you did have a couple of state departments of the GAR. So just to take a step
Hmm.
back, you would have your local level posts, and
Hmm.
then there'd be a state department that would sort of encompassing all of the local posts of a given state. So there'd be
Hmm.
the Department of Pennsylvania, Department of Ohio, and so on. And then there'd be the national level
Hmm.
headquarters, essentially, that had dominion over all of it. And there were a couple of state departments. I believe Ohio was one. I think Nebraska and Kansas were other ones. And they were saying that, they were telling their local posts, when your last member dies or is,
Hmm.
the last remaining member of the post, make sure that that person sends in all of the GAR records to the state archives.
Hmm.
And that's what they did in a couple states. But otherwise, there weren't really directives like that coming from other
Hmm.
states. So what you have is, as we've been hinting at,
Hmm.
is you have this patchwork collection of
Hmm.
records at the local library, and you have
Hmm.
some records at a state archives, but
Hmm.
others aren't going to be there. Some of them have been thrown away over
Hmm.
time. And
Hmm.
I think the GAR was also struggling with who are our inheritors too.
Hmm.
Is it the sons of Union veterans
Right.
based on their blood? Like these are our
Hmm.
children and grandchildren. Should we be seeing them as our inheritors? Or should we be seeing the VFW and the American Legion, who are
Hmm.
connected with us in the sense of, military
Service. Yeah.
service? Are they our inheritors? And so I think they struggle. Like, do we give our
Hmm.
minute books and our records to the sons of Union veterans to care
Hmm.
for, or to the local American Legion post? And I think since there's not really an overarching plan, we end up losing a lot of GAR post records. I think they're just discarded,
Hmm.
and but others are just kind of scattered all over the place. So yeah, it's a challenge. It was a challenge, but like I said, a little bit fun. It's kind of a treasure hunt, trying to find the location of these post records.
Yeah. Oh, like I don't want to get ahead of us, but I kind of have a hard time seeing the American Legion meet in a library these
You know what?
days.
That's probably true. Yeah.
Um, but since you already indicated that some of these post buildings that are connected to libraries are still around, and you road trip quite a bit, so how many of the original libraries with post buildings did you find? And as a kind of follow up on that, which one was your favorite? Which one do you think is the
Ooh.
nicest one?
Oh
Sort of
boy.
like for road tripping purposes.
Yeah, boy, those are great questions. So I'll start with that final question. I think my favorite, and it's going to sound like I'm pandering to my home city, but I do love the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall. It's here in Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
It was again, it was advocated for by the local posts of the Pittsburgh area. They did donate some funds, but they also were able to secure some tax revenue for this
Mm-hmm.
building. They worked with the architects very closely so that their vision was in place in the final
Mm-hmm.
iteration of the project. Um, and so, yeah, I encourage listeners to look up Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall in Pittsburgh, and you'll see this magnificent building.
Mm-hmm.
Once after it was constructed, virtually all of the Pittsburgh area posts abandoned their previous headquarters and they moved their headquarters to this beautiful building.
All right.
Uh, yeah, and what's really interesting about it too is it really serves a multifunctional purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's a museum, it's a
Mm-hmm.
library, it has an auditorium. So it's not just for veterans. It's
Mm-hmm.
for younger generations to come in, maybe enjoy some sort of musical
Mm-hmm.
program, or to look at the artifacts in the museum. Uh, and so again, it's for civic purposes, but it's very
Mm-hmm.
closely tied to memory too, and to the
Mm-hmm.
sacrifices of Union veterans. So in answer to that question, at least, I think my favorite has to be Soldiers and Sailors here in Pittsburgh.
All right.
In terms of how many I encountered, or in terms of how many are still in existence, I would say I'm sure I saw dozens
Mm.
in the course of my research. I don't have an exact number, and I don't have an exact number of how many are still in existence in the United States. I think it would be a great crowdsourcing
Yeah.
opportunity for people to contribute. Does your town still have a GAR
Mm-hmm.
hall? And I bet there are hundreds still across the country. Give you just one example. I did some research in the tiny county of Livingston County in New York, which is just to the west of the Finger Lakes region and
Okay.
just south of Rochester. And I think there's something like 60,000 people in the whole
Mm.
county. Today, there's only 60,000.
Mm.
But there, I found three village GAR post buildings in
Well,
this tiny county of Livingston County that were all constructed in the 1880s or 1890s.
mm.
They serve very in a similar vein as the big one in Pittsburgh. These
Mm.
also served as multifunctional
Mm.
venues. Um, People voted in these buildings.
Mm.
Farmers stored their harvests in these buildings. Other organizations like
Mm.
temperance groups and other veterans groups had their meetings in
Mm.
these GAR halls that
Mm.
are still in existence. So it's fascinating. Like I said, I think there's hundreds still
Mm.
out there. It's just I don't have record of all of them, and I think it'd be quite a project to undertake.
Yeah, if somebody can do that, maybe it's listening to us.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
And but you have some pictures of these buildings also in the book, and some of them are really kind of modest looking two-story brick structures, it looks like. So
Yes,
it's not like you're having the imposing Pittsburgh one, but some of them are very kind of fitting the smaller local community from it, but with the
absolutely.
same goal.
Same goal, and say serve similar functions
Mm.
in terms of like this multifunctional, venue.
Hmm.
But yeah, it just really depended on the funds that the local post might have had, how much success they had in asking for donations from the community or from local governments. And some were more successful than others, and I think that just kind of what you see in towns today is just sort of dependent on the success that the veterans had, um, raising funds.
Isn't that always the case?
Yeah, right. Yeah, in many aspects of life.
Yeah. So when I was reading through your book, you oftentimes sort of used the term monument when you talked about the buildings and the post rooms and sort of the memorial spaces that these post rooms were supposed to be providing for the communities. And it kind of struck me when I was reading that because in the South, where I spent most of my time, it's all littered with these lost cause monuments, oftentimes created by the United or funded, underwritten by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and it's in the courtyard, in the courthouse square somewhere. There stands that soldier monument, and that's how the community remembers. And it doesn't seem like the North has done on a similar level of widespread commemoration. I kind of wondered if sort of by creating these memorial halls and spaces, it became sort of a stand-in for a statue or monument.
I think that's fair to say, and that's not to say that you won't find soldier monuments
Sure.
in small towns throughout the North. You will, but I think you're right that the GAR, part of their collective memory that I'm trying to advance as a theory here, the GAR
Hmm.
collective memory, was to establish what and these are their words, living monuments.
Hmm.
You'll see that phrase littered throughout GAR primary source documents, living
Hmm.
monuments, or you'll see the words usefulness and utility peppered throughout these proposals to set up GAR memorial halls
Hmm.
throughout the North. And it was very much part of their vision that these buildings, these spaces were going to be used for many things. They were going to be used to remember their comrades who had fallen, whether that was during the Civil War or, the ones that aged out and died um, from the GAR itself. These were meeting spaces
Hmm.
for the GAR. These were places, as I said previously, where the public could come
Hmm.
in and use the space for a variety of purposes.
Hmm.
Um, it might have um, it might have a connection to a direct connection to Civil War memory, or it might not. Like I said, the buildings were used for voting. They were used for storage of agricultural goods.
Hmm.
But, one thing I don't think I discussed yet was that the GAR as it became a more mature organization, especially after 1890, was very willing to throw open its doors to the public
Hmm.
and invite them in for programming, basically
Hmm.
programs that they were developing. So, for instance, there were events called open meetings of the GAR where they would invite the public to come to their weekly or monthly meetings and listen to a comrade talk about a battle that he was in, or
Hmm.
to sing songs, Civil War era
Hmm.
songs, or just have a dinner that would be prepared and hosted by the Women's Relief Corps
Hmm.
members. Um, so yeah, just getting back to the fact that these spaces were meant to be used for a variety of purposes, um, but always looking to that Civil War memory,
Hmm.
that proper memory, that proper history of the Civil War and the sacrifices that these men had made during the war.
Yeah. So let me kind of push back a little bit on this because I kind of uh, looked at the notes that I took, and then it's like there's sort of a I mean, we're in a period where we're kind of trying to kind of figure out what is our collective memory of this period. We're kind of how do we remember this war? And you already kind of mentioned Blight was sort of the South's white supremacist, and then the emancipationist North, but it doesn't. The Grand Army of the Republic doesn't really fit into either of those because they are emancipationists, but there's more to their remembrance as well. And I kind of wondered because you have so many of these local camps. You have some active, as you said, and some not very active state departments. How much is the organization actually having sort of one voice versus hundreds of voices from all of their different organizational kind of grounds?
Right, right. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that they're at least in the northern posts. I would still argue that they're singing in a similar voice,
Mm.
if I could put it that way. Um, but I also look in this book at posts in the South. I look at
Mhm.
posts in the West,
Mhm.
and if you look at things regionally, there are different challenges that the GAR faces. depending on the region that you're in. And I think this is kind of addressing
Mm-hmm.
your pushback. And
Yeah.
I agree. I agree with you too that if you look at posts in the South, obviously Union veterans came to the South for business opportunities. Some
Mm-hmm.
were part of the Freedmen's Bureau. You know, maybe they're Freedmen's Bureau agents.
Mm-hmm.
A number of them came south as retirees, essentially, to
Mm-hmm.
enjoy Florida sunshine. And they yeah, and they set up their GAR posts in the South, which is maybe surprising, um, but they do face challenges, right? That people
Mm-hmm.
in that veterans in the North are not going to face. And so in the South, if you're a union veteran, maybe business owner,
Mm-hmm.
it's probably going to be better for you if you get along with your Southern-born white peers, right? For business purposes. Um, you know, and so I think it's very true that the emancipationist memory aspect
Mm-hmm.
in Southern GAR posts is mostly not there, or it's at
Mm-hmm.
least challenged quite a bit by what's going on the ground there. You still have African American posts down
Mm-hmm.
there. You have some integrated posts, but not as I think not as many as you find in the North. You still have African American veterans occupying officer roles in the
Mm-hmm.
South. But again, yeah, it's a totally different regionally. It's just a different challenges that you're facing by the very fact that you're a northern-born person living in
Mm-hmm.
the South. Um, and their northern comrades are going to complain. They're going to say, "Hey, you're not standing up to these white Southerners.
Mm-hmm.
You're participating you're participating at Jefferson Davis's funeral, for example. That was a big thing that got the GAR all riled up. Is that there were
Mm-hmm.
Southern GAR members at his funeral. So you're going to get yourself involved, I guess, in some events that maybe the national level headquarters is not going to appreciate, or that your
Mm-hmm.
northern comrades are not going to appreciate. Out west too, you're going to have challenges as well. Out west, the Wobblies, the IWW, the
Mm-hmm.
International Workers of the World, were strong. GAR not big fans. The GAR of the West not big fans of those people because they see them as akin to Confederates in a way
Mm-hmm.
because they have their own sort of uprising, right? But it's a labor uprising, but it's an
Mm-hmm.
uprising nonetheless that's conflicting with the
Mm-hmm.
orderliness of society there. And so they're facing unique challenges of their own out there, the GAR. So I see what you're saying. There are hundreds, thousands of
Mm-hmm.
different local GAR post voices, I guess. And the best I can say is that I think if you look at the East and the Midwest, you're going to see, as I said, sort of people
Mm-hmm.
singing a similar tune in terms of advancing a GAR memory. But there are those regional challenges and
Mm-hmm.
regional.
And since you brought up the West, I kind of wanted to briefly kind of deal with that too, because I always enjoyed sort of Megan Kate Nelson and Gary Gallagher's little feuds there about the importance of the Civil War West and sort of
Mm,
how much does it matter out there. And I just did a recording that you're following 2 weeks on in the publication of Jonas and Jewel no, Jim Jules's book, and
mm,
he has done work on the Oregon Cavalry and their service during the Civil War. So I kind of you said you were in Oregon and sort of wondered how did veterans, like especially veterans from the East who are moving into the West, how do they feel about individuals who served in, say, the first Oregon or the first or second or third Colorado or the first to fifth New Mexico? How do they feel about these individuals who are saying we're Civil War veterans, even though they really didn't fight
yeah,
the rebel armies per se, or if you didn't
right.
find anything, of course.
Yeah, right. I wish I had a better answer to this, but going through minute books and going through the particular records I was looking at, I was not seeing many signs of confrontation or ill will
Hmm.
between, somebody that belonged to an Oregon regiment versus somebody that fought in all the battles of
Hmm.
on the East Coast that maybe
Hmm.
fought in a Pennsylvania regiment or something like that. I didn't see those types of conflicts. But I think one thing that does tie in interestingly to your question is that the GAR wasn't just the only veterans fraternity that was out
Hmm.
there. There was also, I'm thinking of the UVL, the Union Veterans Legion.
Hmm.
And to be part of the UVL, you had to have 3 years of service in the Union armies to be a member of that organization. Whereas if you're a GAR member, all you need is proof of honorable discharge, no matter how many days, weeks, months you might have served in the army. So there is sort of this conflict, I think, between
Hmm.
those who served a long period of time versus
Hmm.
those who did not. The UVL was never a very big organization, not like the AR, but there was that sort of conflict I think you're talking about. But I wasn't seeing much of a regional
Sure.
conflict between, say, the Westerners and the Easterners.
Yeah, I kind of have a feeling this sort of a very modern kind of debates there that we're having of like which is more important or so.
Yeah. And that's not to say that there wasn't conflict, and
Yeah,
maybe another historian can find the
sure.
answer to that question, but it's just not something I uncovered.
Yeah, yeah, and it wasn't something you were looking for in that either. So, um, sort of before we get into the sort of First World War period, you already mentioned Caroline's book a little bit with sort of remembrance, and the one thing I always remember sort of with her works, the reminder that especially Union veterans weren't necessarily the reconciliation minded ones, that they held on to sort of the perception of betrayal on the part of the South extremely long.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I saw too. I'm in Jani's camp for that sort of thing. The number of times that you would see written in minute books or in GAR directives from
Mm.
headquarters is the word treason or
Mm.
traitorous
Right.
when discussing the not just the Confederate cause, but sometimes it's individual
Hmm.
Confederates.
Right.
Especially the leaders.
Mm.
Lee and Davis. I mean, you'll see that they
Mm.
thought that they were traitors. They're not ashamed to state that. And I think what is one of the stronger pieces of evidence that the GAR was offended by
Mhm.
the Confederacy and about secession is how agitated they would get when anyone tried to propose opening up the GAR
Mhm.
to Confederates. It
Mhm.
didn't happen often, but sometimes there'd be a member who would say, "Hey, why aren't we, you know, accepting a Confederate veteran into our organization?"
Right.
And they would be shouted down angrily. But the other, I guess, piece of evidence there too is that once we get to the Spanish American War
Mhm.
period, the GAR is faced with the question of,
Mhm.
are we going to allow younger generations of veterans into our organization? And there are a couple reasons why the Grand Army of the Republic remains only for Union veterans
Mhm.
and thus sets itself on a path of eventual
Right.
extinction. But one of the major reasons is because they are afraid that allowing a Spanish American War veteran into their organization could mean accepting a Confederate veteran. Because
Mhm.
if you think about it, we have people like Joe Wheeler or Fitzhugh Lee, or we have some other examples of people who fought in the Confederate armies but also fought in the Spanish American War. Hypothetically, does that mean they could join the Grand Army of the Republic? But they're also fearful of, I think, just adulterating their membership by potentially allowing the children or grandchildren of a Confederate veteran
Mhm.
into the Grand Army of the Republic if that person had fought in the Spanish American War. So, um, yeah, I think that notion that they just, they were not going to get over the
Mhm.
fact that these were essentially traitors. That secession was a treasonous act, and yeah, I think that membership question is really good evidence of that.
Mhm. Yeah, it sort of reminds me of this thing was in the on a book on the Mexican War and the remembrance of the Mexican War of how after the Civil War pensions goes through, they're finally doing pensions for the Mexican War veterans. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the big hangups is Well, Jefferson Davis was a
Yeah,
veteran of this war,
right.
and we would have to give him a pension unless we find a way to exclude that person.
Yeah, yeah. They see it very much as a slippery
Yeah.
slope.
Hmm.
Yeah,
But
so
it,
it's
it is
interesting.
also interesting because you're consciously saying there isn't this is a terminal organization. We will have an end date. Like you don't most organizations don't do that because they want to remain alive, but it takes a commitment to say, no, we're gonna be done.
Right, right. And they had another opportunity, obviously, with World
Yeah.
War One to
Hmm.
rethink that strategy. They decide that they are happy with you know putting an end date on their organization.
Right.
And I think it's not only that fear of allowing Southerners,
Hmm.
maybe the children or grandchildren of Confederate veterans into the organization, but also I think there is sometimes an implicit, sometimes an explicit belief that their cause was the most just cause
Hmm.
that any generation of Americans fought for, in warfare. I mean, there are examples where the Union veterans needled the Spanish American War veterans a little bit about their cause being more important. They're the ones that saved the country. The Spanish American War veterans, they're trying to expand, I guess, American influence
Hmm.
abroad. Is
Hmm.
that as important to the
Hmm.
American story? And I think most GR veterans would say no, it's not as important. That their cause was the supreme one, and I think that's also a reason then why they um, are content with
Hmm.
being an eventually extinct organization.
But since I'm really liking how you're like opening the doors to the next place I want to go anyway. Because the Spanish American War of 1898, or however we want to call it, yes, it's about war about expansion, and it's not as important from a veteran's perspective as the Civil War, but the veterans that are part of the Grand Army are in support of this expansion. They having, at least if I read your book correctly, they have sort of a global minded spirit of how the United States should project into the world.
Yes, so right, I do have this chapter in the book about the GAR veterans global reach, and it encompasses a few things. I talk a bit about posts, GAR posts that were in foreign lands. We
Hmm.
have at least five posts that were in Canada. We have a post in Mexico. We have a post in Hawaii. We have a couple in Alaska. There's one even in Lima, Peru. So wherever these guys are finding business opportunities or migrating, they're going to set up a post if there are enough of them. So I do talk about that. I talk about their feelings on the Spanish American War and expansion, and it was a very tough chapter to write
Hmm.
because the GAR, as you said, tends to be expansionist minded. Mostly enthusiastic about imperialism. And I thought to myself, well, can that be progressive or progressive
Hmm.
minded, right? And eventually I had to just settle on and convince myself that there is fluidity to
Hmm.
that definition of progressivism and that imperialism and progressivism could thrive together.
Hmm.
We have some US progressives who feel that civilizing the world
Hmm.
can legitimize and fast track reform efforts at home. And I think the GAR is in that camp. I think they really feel like, you know, we regenerated the United States by reaffirming liberty and
Hmm.
order and democracy. Why not spread that regeneration to the rest of the world?
Hmm.
And that comes with racial inequities, that comes with economic coercion, that comes with the denial of sovereignty, of people's sovereignty. Um, that was their worldview, I think. And I think not only with Spanish American War, but they certainly feel that too with World War One
Hmm.
as well. That they're spreading these ideals abroad, or they're at least supporting those who are going off to do that, their sons and their grandsons off.
And I want to spend a little time on that because it's you had so many nice pictures, and even the front picture of your book is exactly like that, right? Of like the the grandpa looking guy from the Civil War with the young guy going off to Europe potentially to fight the next war, and it's like it it felt there's sort of this. Is it sort of imparting wisdom or kind of like handing the scepter on to the next generation? Like it felt like this like very untypical thing because the United States is not that militaristic kind of country usually that,
Mhm.
right? It's sort of in the British tradition of like we only do military when it's absolutely necessary, and it felt a little more martial in that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Yeah, so yeah, to address this, I do think that the members saw the doughboys of World War One as carrying on a legacy. They
Mm,
saw the Civil War and World War One as inextricably linked.
mm,
You look at the rhetoric they're using. They're using the rhetoric from Abraham Lincoln when he says that slavery and freedom, cannot stand together. They're they're basically saying the same thing about the world in
mm,
1915, 16, 17, that autocracy and democracy cannot stand together in the world. They're drawing those comparisons. They're drawing comparisons to the Kaiser of Germany being a slave owner over his subjects and over the people, the peoples that he's conquering in World War II, that they're slaves essentially. Um, so I guess with some degree of hubris, GAR veterans, they see their sacrifices in the Civil War as almost a prelude to
mm,
the doughboys going off and lifting up the Europeans out of
mm,
bondage.
right.
And I think that they do put their money where their mouth is too, though, because they
Mm,
are active home front volunteers, and I discussed this in the book too. That these you'll see countless examples of I would say reformist type
mhm,
activities. Some of them are kind of funny. You'll see these old men going to their local recruitment office, trying to enlist. They're 70 years old at this point. Of course, they're not going to.
We're
Uh,
not that desperate.
you're right. We're not that desperate, and it's probably more for show,
Mhm,
to show they're bigger and everything. But they might be inspiring young men, or at least shaming young men to,
mhm,
to go to their recruitment offices and join the armed services. These men are manning the recruitment tables
mhm,
to recruit young men to the war effort. They are obviously they're participating in parades that are
mhm,
seeing these men off, to the training camps or to the
mhm,
ships that'll take them to Europe. But they're also disciplining the home front
mhm,
for the war too. So they're very active in food conservation efforts. They're promoting those victory gardens during World War One. They're promoting economic
mhm,
patriotism, so buying Liberty bonds. You'll see so many minute books of the posts deciding that they want to buy $100 or $500
mhm,
or $1,000 Liberty bonds in support of the war. So, um, and I think in the back of their mind too, they're remembering that sometimes during the Civil War, they were insufficiently prepared for that
mhm,
war, or they were insufficiently supported by the home front during the Civil War. I think they remember that, and they want to make sure that they're providing the proper support for
mhm,
their grandsons,
mhm.
that are going off to war.
Yeah. Yeah. On the other hand, I'm kind of wondering about like I mean, when you look at the First World War, the Irish are very happy in supporting the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Irish and German immigrants, foreign-born soldiers made up a huge percentage of the U.S. Army. So how do members can we actually trace in some form how members like that were of German or Irish backgrounds felt about this decision?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I think we have maybe a partial picture of that
Mm,
sort of thing. So, you, as you said, what I think 200,000 Germans
yeah,
participated in
it's
something like that in the Civil War. Um, and they're going to join the GAR too.
Hmm.
Irish-born veterans are going to join. German-born GAR veterans are going to join.
Hmm.
When I would look at rosters
Hmm.
of local posts, I would see an intermixing, and I sort of had to
Hmm.
deduce like, oh, this looks like a Germanic name. This was probably a
Hmm.
German-born individual, and he's joining a local post with maybe more Anglo,
Hmm.
folks. So I didn't see a whole lot of, say, um, separation by
Hmm.
ethnic group in the local posts. They seem to be pretty well intermixed.
Hmm.
However, there were some examples that I found of German majority posts.
Hmm.
I'm thinking of the Peisner posts in Rochester, New York, as an example. That seemed to be primarily made up of German-born immigrants that fought in the Civil War. And I do find examples of the GAR, the sort of Anglo side of the GAR, sinking to the level of anti-German prejudices from
Hmm.
time to time. You do see rhetoric about GAR members saying, "Oh, immigrants must naturalize as quickly as possible,
Hmm.
adopt the language, that sort of thing." You see GAR members creating poems against the Kaiser and
Hmm.
making fun of the Kaiser in that way. You see, I guess, somewhat concerning reports of GAR posts going into the local schools,
Hmm.
and I'm thinking of an example where there was some report that they had of a teacher in Minnesota placing the German flag above the American flag on the
Hmm.
chalkboard or something like that, and they're going to investigate
Hmm.
it. And it most likely was that this teacher was probably just doing a geography lesson, and,
Hmm.
and one flag happened to go
Right.
above the other. It offended the GAR veterans, though. I think that there is probably some truth to that law and order aspect to the GAR. I'm not
Hmm.
trying to discount that, because yeah, we do see examples of this, more maybe xenophobic or anti-immigrant
Hmm.
stance sometimes, especially in times of crisis like World War One.
Yeah, and well, they're far cry from what the American Legion will do eventually.
Sure, sure, very much. Yeah.
But to kind of one more question was sort of regard to the this period, and then I have one last one for you. But Wilson, right? The last of the progressive presidents. And since your book is about the Grand Army and the progressive era, it seems fitting that he is in there with sort of what in your book. But he is a really oddball case for the veterans because he goes out to Arlington and dedicates the monument that the UDC helped fund. And of course, then the veterans like him because he takes the country into the war. So it's sort of like it seems like a real bit of a love-hate relationship that the veterans have with Wilson.
Right. Yeah, it is an interesting story, and hopefully it sheds new light because I don't think you often think of GAR veterans having
Hmm.
this relationship with someone like Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
But you know, as I've said before, the GAR was a pretty strongly Republican leaning organization. They had a bad relationship with the only post-Civil War 19th century Democrat, Grover Cleveland. Uh, Cleveland famously tried to return Confederate battle flags back to the South, which the GAR was strongly against, obviously. Cleveland vetoed pension legislation.
Mm.
So he's winning no converts to the Democratic Party. So Wilson already has strikes going against him when he's elected president. He's a Democrat. He basically wins because he split the vote between Teddy Roosevelt and
Hmm.
Taft. He's a Southerner, right? He's
Hmm.
from Virginia, born in Virginia.
Yep.
His parents, as I recall, were Northern born but migrated to the South, and I
Hmm.
believe were slaveholders. If I'm not, his
Hmm.
parents were slaveholders, as I recall. And he also has no military background. Teddy Roosevelt had military background, and they loved Teddy Roosevelt, obviously.
Yeah,
Woodrow
that little
Wilson,
thing in Cuba.
yeah, that's it. So Woodrow Wilson, as I said, has a lot of strikes going against him. He, you mentioned the Arlington flap. He actually
Mm-hmm.
initially turned down an invitation to address mostly Union veterans at Arlington for
Mm-hmm.
Memorial Day.
Yeah.
He rescinds that and he actually does speak to them, but he realizes, I think, he made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
But he also skips, or I'm sorry, he almost skips the 1913 Gettysburg reunion to go vacation with his family. I think Wilson's aides say, "You better make an appearance," and he does. He does show up for like 47 minutes or something like that, and he gives a very reconciliationist speech,
Mm-hmm.
which the Union veterans don't think much of. So you're right that if it was not for World War One interceding, I don't think the GAR would have ever had a positive view
Mm-hmm.
of Wilson. But when the crisis happens and when the U.S. is trying to walk this fine line of neutrality, they appreciate what he's trying to do. That he's not rushing into war. These guys are not uh, they don't want to rush the nation's young into a war. They know how terrible war is, but they do appreciate military preparedness. They appreciate the things Wilson is doing to
Mm-hmm.
prepare in case war happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Wilson and the GAR are on the same page that you kind of let things ramp
Mm-hmm.
up in terms of egregious German actions, the Lusitania and so
Mm-hmm.
forth, until war eventually happens. And, and when it does happen, they're fully on board with, as I
Mm-hmm.
said, those sort of home front activities that are needed to win the war.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's yeah, not much else to add there. It's an interesting dichotomy
It is.
in
It
that
is.
regard.
Yeah. A
So
lot of
as
contradictions with the GAR that you have to tease out.
yes, that definitely came through in your book too. That sort of the challenge of like where do they actually stand?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So kind of as we're doing good, but right. No, you do want your Saturday afternoon as well, and spend time with wife and cat.
No
Um,
problem. No problem.
I kind of was singing like when I look at like there's been a lot of Civil War memory has been an explosive field. There's been a lot of books published over the years and articles published as well. And like, I mean, I'm adding one soon to that list of articles that are out there on kind of different aspects of memory. Um, and we have a lot of works on the lost cause, obviously. But it also feels like there is a growing interest in the Grand Army of the Republic. And I kind of wondered why in part do you think that is? Is it because we're having to reevaluate it because it's like in the context of modern day veteran organizations, modern day veteran debate, something that we want to look at again? What sort of your sense on like why is the Grand Army so interesting again for
Yeah,
scholars?
yeah. I think there are a lot of threads involved in answering that question. But for historians of Civil War memory, as you said, the Lost Cause was for so long, the dominant narrative, and I think
Hmm.
we're only beginning to scratch the surface of um, examining those other types of collective memory
Hmm.
that maybe David Blake didn't cover. And I'm modestly trying to push that GAR collective memory
Hmm.
out there. And I think there are others to investigate, and that historians can still investigate. Again, I don't think there was a neatness to North and South. We see those pictures of the Confederate veterans and the Union
Hmm.
veterans shaking hands across the stone walls over the fought, and it's a pleasing picture, but it's far more complicated, and I think we're still only scratching the surface of it. But also for historians, the GAR is so wrapped up in so many interesting debates
Hmm.
and themes and legislation that I haven't even touched. We haven't really
Hmm.
touched pensions.
Right.
We haven't touched really those early years of the GAR when they were
Hmm.
so invested in partisanship and
Hmm.
Republican politics. um, their tentacles are everywhere when you look
Hmm.
at the post-Civil War period, and it really depends, I think, on which temporal period you're
Hmm.
looking at of the GAR. So, you know, we have those 90 years of GAR existence to look at,
Hmm.
and I think depending on which area or which time period you're looking at, you're going to find interesting new things to investigate
Hmm.
regarding this organization. And obviously, we still have these debates about Confederate flags and Confederate monuments, and I can't help but see the ghosts of
Hmm.
GAR veterans
Right.
standing behind those monuments,
Yeah.
you know, trying to offer their opinion on the matter.
Hmm.
And I think we can investigate that more too.
Yeah. Well, and I also was thinking as you were talking that today, like, actually, let me start in the past. Like, it seemed like a vibrant environment where the veterans were given a lot of kind of attention, and it almost reminds you of today's environment where veterans are also kind of pedestaled in a lot of ways and kind of yeah, I'm just thinking of like baseball games or sporting games, and veterans are asked to stand up, or parking lots where you have veteran parking, and it seems like there's sort of it's sort of a cyclical thing in the US that like after the Civil War and now after sort of Vietnam, the war on
Mm-hmm.
terror, there's sort of this a massive resurgence of the veterans are more than just the citizen soldiers that goes to war and blends back in.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a cyclical thing to that. I also have to wonder if it's the GAR that really ushers in maybe the
Mm,
first time in American history that veterans are
mm,
being seen in that way.
yeah,
Don't quote me on that. Maybe somebody could challenge that, but I think because they were such a large,
yeah.
I think maybe the GAR is maybe the first time that happens. Um, but I guess I would also be remiss in not saying that there is that other school out there, that dark turn of Civil War history,
Hmm.
that's saying that there were veterans that were not being
Hmm.
Union veterans that were not being maybe treated as they should have. If you think of
Hmm.
the works of Brian Matthew Jordan,
Yeah.
James Martin, who were saying that that the younger generations of non-veterans
Hmm.
really didn't care about these guys that much,
Right.
and maybe we're anti-pension, you
Hmm.
know. So again, it's a complicated story
Yeah.
with so many threads to pull.
Can't say more. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, at this stage, I think we gave a good preview of your book. And for those who are interested in getting it, it's with Fordham University Press, and the title is Our Onward March, the Grand Army of the Republic in the Progressive Era. So I greatly appreciate you taking the time to talk about your book today.
I greatly appreciated the discussion. Thank you, Niels.